a young boy in Venice during the 13th century, staring across the glittering waters of the Adriatic Sea. You watch ships glide into port, their sails heavy with spices, silks, and stories from lands you can only imagine. The salty air carries whispers of far-off kingdoms, bustling markets, and treasures hidden beyond the horizon. This boy was Marco Polo, and his curiosity would lead him further than almost any European of his time. His journeys would connect east and west in ways the world had never seen before, leaving behind a story that still inspires dreamers, adventurers, and explorers 7 centuries later. Marco Polo was born in 1254, in the powerful city-state of Venice. At the time, Venice was not just a city, it was a republic, a naval power, and one of the great trading hubs of Europe. Exotic goods poured into its markets: pepper, cinnamon, silk, precious gems, and gold. For a boy like Marco, this environment must have felt like the center of the universe. His father, Niccolo Polo, and uncle, Maffeo Polo, were wealthy Venetian merchants. They specialized in long-distance trade, which often took them across the Mediterranean, through the Black Sea, and into the mysterious heartlands of Asia. Marco's mother passed away when he was still young, leaving him in the care of relatives. Perhaps this early loss helped instill in him a sense of independence and resilience, traits that would later carry him across thousands of miles of dangerous terrain. Before Marco was even old enough to walk the bustling streets of Venice freely, his father and uncle had already embarked on a long journey eastward. They traveled across the Byzantine Empire, through Persia, and eventually reached the court of a man who would soon dominate Marco's life story: Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler and grandson of Genghis Khan. Niccolo and Maffeo spent years in Kublai Khan's service, forging relationships with the Mongols and learning about the cultures of Asia. When they finally returned to Venice in 1269, Marco was 15 years old. He had grown up hearing tales of faraway kingdoms, but now his father and uncle brought first-hand stories of the Mongol Empire, of strange customs, and of lands richer than Venice itself. In 1271, Marco Polo, just 17 years old, set out with his father and uncle on a journey that would last more than 2 decades. They carried with them a letter from the Pope, addressed to Kublai Khan, and gifts intended to impress the great Mongol ruler. Their route would take them overland, through some of the harshest and most unpredictable landscapes on Earth. They crossed the Middle East, traveling through Acre and the Holy Land, moving into Persia, then across the deserts of Central Asia. They braved extreme heat, biting cold, and the constant threat of bandits. For a teenager like Marco, this must have been both terrifying and exhilarating. Unlike most boys his age, who dreamed of inheriting a business or fishing in Venetian waters, Marco's playground was the Silk Road itself. The journey was grueling. Crossing the deserts of Persia tested their endurance. The heat was unbearable, water was scarce, and they had to rely on the hospitality of local tribes and merchants along the route. In Afghanistan, they struggled through treacherous mountain passes where avalanches and landslides could strike without warning. But for Marco, every hardship was also an education. He absorbed details about the cultures they encountered, noting local customs, religious practices, and ways of life. These observations would later become the backbone of his famous travel account. After nearly 3 years of travel, the Polos finally reached China, entering the court of the most powerful ruler in the world, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was not just a conqueror, he was a visionary ruler who wanted to bring together the vast territories of his empire with knowledge, trade, and governance. He welcomed the Polos warmly. Marco, with his youthful energy and quick intelligence, immediately caught the emperor's attention. Marco learned Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, and other languages during his stay. His curiosity and ability to adapt impressed Kublai Khan, who soon entrusted him with important missions across the empire. Marco traveled widely in China, acting as the Khan's emissary, inspecting cities, negotiating with officials, and observing the richness of Mongol rule. For nearly 17 years, Marco Polo lived in China. He saw wonders that no European had ever described before: the bustling city of Hangzhou, with its millions of residents, the marvel of paper money used for trade, coal being burned as fuel, and massive networks of canals and ships transporting goods. He described Kublai Khan's court as a place of unimaginable luxury: silks, jewels, golden halls, banquets with hundreds of dishes, and entertainers from across Asia. But Marco was not blinded by wealth. He took careful note of administration, infrastructure, and culture. He recorded how the Mongols organized their postal system with relay stations, how they conducted census counts, and how markets thrived in cities larger than any in Europe. After nearly 2 decades in service to the Khan, the Polos longed to return home. Kublai Khan, reluctant to lose them, finally agreed on one condition: they would escort a Mongol princess to Persia, where she was to be married. In 1292, the Polos joined a fleet that sailed from China, crossing the South China Sea, passing through Sumatra, India, and the Persian Gulf. The voyage was perilous. Storms struck, diseases spread, and many lives were lost. But the Polos survived, eventually delivering the princess to her destination. From there, they journeyed back to Venice. When Marco Polo returned to Venice in 1295, he was 41 years old. He had left as a teenager and returned as a man who had seen more of the world than almost anyone alive. But Venice was at war with Genoa, and within a year of his return, Marco was captured during a naval battle. It was in prison that Marco Polo's story truly began to spread. He shared his adventures with a fellow prisoner, Rustichello da Pisa, a writer who turned Marco's memories into a book. The result was Il Milione, known in English as The Travels of Marco Polo. The book astonished Europe. Marco described lands most Europeans had never imagined: Japan, which he called Sipangu, the wealth of China, the wonders of Southeast Asia, and the grand organization of the Mongol Empire. Some readers believed him, others dismissed his stories as fabrications. But whether true or exaggerated, his accounts opened the European imagination to Asia. Christopher Columbus carried a copy of Polo's book on his voyage to the New World, inspired by tales of riches in the East. Merchants, mapmakers, and explorers poured over his descriptions, fueling centuries of exploration and trade. Marco Polo was released from prison in 1299 and returned to Venice, where he married and raised 3 daughters. Though he never traveled as far again, his fame spread. When asked on his deathbed in 1324 whether his stories were true, he reportedly replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." This single line captures the spirit of Marco Polo: not a mere merchant, not just a traveler, but a man who bridged 2 worlds and expanded the horizons of human imagination. Facts about Marco Polo. Marco Polo was only 17 when he began his journey to Asia. He spent nearly 24 years away from Venice. He served as an official envoy for Kublai Khan, traveling across China. Marco Polo introduced Europeans to the concept of paper money. He also described coal as black stones that burn like firewood. He may have been among the first Europeans to hear about Japan. His book was nicknamed Il Milione because people joked he exaggerated with 1,000,000 stories. Christopher Columbus carried Polo's book on his voyages. Some medieval Europeans doubted his accounts because they sounded too extraordinary. On his deathbed, Polo insisted he hadn't even told half of what he had seen. Marco Polo's life reminds us of the power of curiosity. He was not a warrior or a king, yet his journeys reshaped the way the world thought about itself. He crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans not for conquest, but for knowledge. He listened, observed, and shared. His story sparked centuries of exploration, discovery, and cultural exchange. In every sense, Marco Polo was a bridge between East and West. His life tells us that the world is bigger than we imagine, richer than we expect, and always waiting for those brave enough to seek it. Just as Marco looked beyond the horizon, so too can we, because the spirit of exploration lives in all of us.